The following program contains strong racial language which may be unsuitable for some audiences. While of a sensitive nature, WALB has chosen to air this archived footage in its entirety as part of the historical context of the program. The language used in this program does not reflect the views of WALB, its employees and sponsors, nor its parent company, Gray Television. Viewer discretion is advised.
Jim Knight with WALB Television News. We're soliciting the views of Albany people on the Civil Rights Bill. Would you like to give us your views?
Being a Southerner, I'm not for it at all.
This is the most ridiculous thing that has ever happened. The niggers are just as free as we are.
What I'd have to say wouldn't be fit to go on air.
I sure don't like it, that's for sure.
I see. Do you feel this will have any effect on your life directly?
I imagine it will.
Thank you very much.
I'm afraid we might have niggers to live next door to us.
Thank you.
The Albany movement did not begin through the instigation of any outside persons.
He wasn't ready to go to jail. He wasn't ready to have a movement. He was just coming down to make a speech.
I didn't want anybody else telling me, I got your freedom.
It was really critical there for a while. Baby, we talking about the Ku Klux Klan. She said, if you ever forget that under that sheet is the heart of a child of God, you need to quit preaching. We really never felt that we had a movement that we planned, organized, and trained people for in Albany.
You had these young people. Things were not moving fast enough for them. And the older people, and Dr. King and others in SCLC, didn't want to do that.
It almost happened spontaneously.
We knew we were not doing anything wrong. This is a right that every American citizen should have.
There's an energy when you look and you see those people gathered, and it's contagious.
God knows, Reverend, I don't want you in my jail.
We must be willing to fill up the jails all over the state of God.
WALB News presents a 1-hour special report. Our history. Road to Equality.
The Albany Civil Rights Movement started in early 1961. Black citizens could not vote, could not enter the bus station or the library, or swim in the swimming pool with white citizens.
It was the young people that demanded change, and soon Albany black business owners joined them.
Now, their cries for equality gained international attention over the next 2 years. Against heavy odds, their goals finally became law. It was a time when ordinary men and women stood tall, and today are remembered as heroes who brought about a better Albany and a better America.
Now, I recently talked with two men who lived it. Dr. William Anderson, he was the president of the Albany movement, and Reverend Andrew Young, who was at the side of Dr. Martin Luther King when he came to Albany.
Giving the students credit. They started the Albany movement.
Now 91 years old and living outside Detroit, Dr. William Anderson remembers 1961 when members of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, came to South Georgia and organized voter registration rallies.
So when the students started the voter registration project, I left my office and went and joined them and went off to jail with them.
Albany professionals joined with national organizations and started meeting. The name Albany Movement was chosen. Church rallies happened nightly, marches began, and hundreds were arrested.
We, the Albany Movement now, a neutral name, we became the epicenter of the civil rights movement of the nation. And people came from literally all over the country and from some foreign countries.
Dr. Anderson called on a close friend of his wife's family, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to speak. December 15, 1961, Dr. King came to Albany along with Reverend Andrew Young, Dr. Ralph Abernathy, and Reverend Wyatt Walker. They were in for a surprise.
But he wasn't ready to go to jail. He wasn't ready to have a movement. He was just coming down to make a speech.
But Young says after Dr. King's speech, the Albany movement could not be stopped.
People all out in the street, and Dr. Anderson got what we call freedom high. And he said, "We're going to jail. Who all's going to jail with Martin Luther King?" And he said, "Wait a minute, Andy, we didn't, I'm not," but the people started screaming, and he was sort of trapped into demonstrating.
December 16th, Dr. King led what became known as the Freedom Walk in downtown Albany. Hundreds were arrested for protesting for voting rights and equality. After an agreement was reached with Albany's mayor and city commission to negotiate, Dr. King was released from jail. The commission reneged on the agreement at the time, but Young says the Albany movement was the learning moment to continue Dr. King's dream.
It really trained us for what was to come, and certainly was, well, it was a very important part in his life and in mine.
It was concluded by the press that Martin Luther King was a failure in Albany. But what they don't know is Albany was never the same after that.
In the coming years, all the goals of the Albany movement asked for: voting rights for blacks, black law enforcement and city employees, and desegregated public facilities and schools came to be.
Young said that Dr. King often said the lessons learned in Albany were instrumental in Birmingham and Selma as the civil rights movement grew across the nation. Despite struggles of the civil rights era, families like the Sherrods grew united by the love they had for people and the passion to ensure equality for everyone. Charles Sherrod was the first SNCC field secretary and director for Southwest Georgia. His leadership led to the organization of the Albany movement, to his participation in the Selma voting rights movement, and in many other historic initiatives in the 1960s. Through his work, he met the woman that would become his wife, Shirley Miller.
She was born in Baker County and had a first-hand experience of the harsh realities of the time. Her father was shot and killed by a white farmer, reportedly over a livestock dispute.
Now, an all-white grand jury let his killer go free. Shirley says that inspired her to stay in the South and fight for change.
I had no intention of becoming part of the civil rights movement. I had no intention of staying in the South, and I definitely didn't want to have anything more to do with the farm, with agriculture in my life. So my plans were not to become involved. My plans were to get as far away from this area as I could.
And what brought Reverend Charles Sherrod to Southwest Georgia?
I was with the SNCC organization, student of the Island Coordinating Committee.
And at what point did Reverend Charles Sherrod get involved in the Albany movement?
Shortly after.
And shortly after, Shirley Miller met her future husband, Minister Charles Sherrod, while working for SNCC. Reverend Sherrod had been trained on the campus of Shaw University with other young people, including John Lewis, Julian Bond, Ruby Doris Smith, Diane Nash, and Ella Baker. Now, this was very important because he used his training and his role as the first field secretary of SNCC to help galvanize the Albany movement. That movement would lead to marches, meetings, and threats, not just in Albany, but in surrounding counties as well.
He was actually training the local people in Terrell County to operate their meetings, their mass meetings. And coming out of seminary, of course, he's starting with the devotion. And just as he finished the scripture and a song, prayer and a song, the doors of the church opened and sheriffs from 4 counties, as well as other white men, walked into the church. So with guns. With guns. And they had billy clubs and so forth, right? And he knew at that point that he could not turn the meeting over to the local people. So to give himself time to think, he started the devotion over again. These people, you know, they were not gonna, they church people too. So they would not come on in and do what they were attempting to do until he finished. And when he finished, he had a plan in place. He said, I want to introduce the visitors. And 2 of the visitors were reporters from I think it was the Associated Press and the Atlanta Constitution. So once he introduced them, then those people coming into the church that night knew that whatever happened there that night would be put out for the whole world to read, and it was.
The Sherrod's work has not just been about civil rights. Their push has also been for voting rights, farmers' rights, educational rights, and welfare rights. In essence, access. And how far has Albany come since the Albany movement? What is the legacy?
Face of fear became the face of fearlessness.
The Sherrods also shared this with me. It is the order, or a copy of the order from South Carolina in 1961, where Reverend Sherrod and 13 others were arrested for trespassing during a demonstration at the McCrory's Variety Store in Rock Hill, South Carolina. All of the protesters were found guilty and sentenced to a $100 fine or 30 days hard labor. Reverend Sherrod served on the chain gang. On January 28, 2015, the charges filed against him were dismissed.
South Georgia's history and impact on the civil rights movement was vast. Many people still living here today were instrumental in bringing about a change that would later impact the country and influence the world.
One of those women, Evelyn Toney. She walks us through what it was like to be the first black woman arrested in the city during that time and the spark it prompted in the movement. We shall go together.
WALB News presents a one-hour special report. Our History, Road to Equality.
Many of the participants in Albany's civil rights movement were defended by attorney C.B. King. He was the first black lawyer in the area.
Now, King was known for his courage and his courtroom eloquence in the face of fierce and at times violent opposition.
Now, we sat down with two of his children to talk about his endurance during the movement and what it was like growing up King. Attorney C.B. King was one of the few African-American lawyers in the entire state and the only black lawyer south of Atlanta who would take on civil and criminal cases.
He had just gotten honored. This is Dr. King, again in December of 1961. He comes to Albany. This is the first major campaign after Montgomery. That's Dr. William Anderson there and my father over his shoulder. But my father was the only black lawyer here. This is in 1970. This is as he's watching the results. He's the first black man to run for governor. So Stacey Abrams stands on his shoulders in 1970. He's watching the results.
He was the first black man since Reconstruction, did you tell me?
Why that's significant, Carla, in part is, think about it, the Voting Rights Act wasn't passed until 1965. And if it wasn't passed until 65, even before then, he goes ahead and he runs, giving black folk for the first time a reason to register to vote, to say, listen, this is the first. This is before an Andrew Young. This is before a lot of the congressional figures you think of, like, you know, Cynthia McKinney. He was the first.
Still another photo. Is that that's Pritchett?
That's Pritchett behind there, and that's Don Hollowell. If you see right behind Hollowell, that is Dr. William Anderson, who was head, of course, the first president of the Albany movement, my uncle Slater being the second, and of course that's Martin Luther King. These were reporters who were covering it, and this would have been in December of 1961. This is on Jackson Street in the heart of Harlem where my father had his office. I think it was 221 Jackson Street, and he's talking to his two clients, Abernathy and Dr. King, as they're about to head back to Atlanta. This is in 1970. He's talking to Hosea Williams. Next
Julian
to him,
Bond.
right?
Andy Young.
Right, exactly. Who I ended up working for 3 years as a special assistant to the mayor in the 80s. This, of course, is also in 1970 in the heat of battle when he's the first black man. Of course, there's Jimmy Carter in the foreground.
There is one story that I have about my mom and my uncle Slater, who was in the community, who came by one evening, and my father was always on the road, and mom would be at home with 5 kids alone. And he came in with a little brown paper bag, and he was whispering, and my mother would sew. Her sewing machine was in my room, and she would sew at night, and I was in bed. He came in, there was a kind of little going back and forth, and he left, and she was a little nervous. And as it turns out, later on in the evening, after I fell asleep but woke up again, my lights were out in my room, and my mother was sitting in front of my window, which was, my bedroom was on the front of the house. And at night, I could see her silhouette and her cigarette glowing and her cup of coffee in this mound, only to find out the next day what she was really so afraid of was that Uncle Slater had come by to give her a gun because my father was on the road, and it was normal for us to have threatening calls come to the house, things like that. And so because my dad was on the road representing people, so my mom was really pretty hot. I mean, she was terrified of that gun, but that is what I remember about her and the kind of courage that I thought that it took as a woman at home with a husband that was out on the road like that and 5 kids at home. That it was just a very strong figure
to protect.
Yes.
Albany's federal courthouse was named in Attorney C.B. King's honor. That is a photo of hubby with your mom at that dedication. And you're talking about a special, you know, of course, that has to take an act of Congress, out of Congressman Sanford Bishop.
At the time, I did not know that that courthouse was the very first federal courthouse in the former Jim Crow South named for a black man. And I think that's significant.
That is very significant. C.B. King passed away in 1988. Carole King lived another 9 years before her death in 2007.
Many advocates still living today say the music of the movement helped them keep their faith even in the most trying times.
Just ahead, we'll introduce you to one of the original freedom singers still living right here in Albany and the momentum she helped build in the South and later across the country.
The following program contains strong racial language which may be unsuitable for some audiences. While of a sensitive nature, WALB has chosen to air this archived footage in its entirety as part of the historical context of the program. The language used in this program does not reflect the views of WALB, its employees and sponsors, nor its parent company, Gray Television. Viewer discretion is advised. WALB News presents a 1-hour special report. Our History, Road to Equality.
The church was the one place people could gather, doors wide open. Movement leaders would meet nightly, inspiring all ages to continue the fight in spite of the threats and dangers they faced.
But as Grayson Passmore tells us, not every church in Albany was able to keep their doors open.
In a time when doors were slammed in people's faces, not to be reopened for African Americans, there was one place welcoming people, doors and arms wide open.
That the church, Mount Zion, and churches like Mount Zion was the lifeline of the movement.
Mount Zion Baptist Church's pastor Daniel Simmons says the church in Albany was the one place you could go to feel safe and at home, no matter the color of your skin.
Without the church offering a space and a place for the movement to meet, to disseminate information, to gather, to inspire the people, the movement would not have been as successful.
But not every church was as fortunate to be able to keep their doors open. Faced with violence and threats of closure, staying open wasn't always an option.
There were churches that were called by banks and said, if you allow a meeting to be held at your church, we will call for your mortgage and take your church from you.
Mount Zion was completely paid for, making the loud threats from banks and employers obsolete. But what did ring true for the people who gathered nightly in the sanctuary of wooden pews was the promise of a better tomorrow, a tomorrow led by people with love, not hate in their hearts.
A place where there was a language and a gospel that gave context to the movement and made people believe in their heart that it was right.
A huge part of the Albany Civil Rights Movement surpassed South Georgia. A group known as the Freedom Singers started in Albany and made an impact in the nationwide movement.
The Freedom Singer has carried me to many, many places. This group traveled 50,000 plus miles in 9 months, covering 46 states.
And it didn't stop there. Original Freedom Singer Rutha Harris sang in Turkey, Spain, and Portugal then, and continues sharing her message now around South Georgia, most recently at the Apollo.
When we come back, meet Frank Wilson. He grew up in the civil rights movement, and now, he says, spreading that knowledge and history with others is truly a dream come true.
WALB News presents a one-hour special report. Our history, Road to Equality.
In a time where blacks could not get ahead due to laws imposing on their freedom, one historic figure within the Albany community recalls hints of hope in his hometown of Moultrie.
Now, he tells Damon Arnold the city was ahead of its time in more ways than one.
I tell folk I was Moultrie born, Moultrie bred, and when I die, I'll be Moultrie dead.
Standing in front of his childhood home, Frank Wilson reflects on the city of Moultrie with pride. Recognized as a more progressive area for blacks in the 1950s and 60s, during a time where civil rights were limited, yet hopes were high.
As I look up and down 3rd Street here and think about the era in which we're talking about, we had a flourishing African-American community.
Wilson, who is the executive director of the Albany Civil Rights Institute, says a lapse in resources pushed the city ahead in different aspects.
Colquitt County did not house civil rights prisoners.
Many community members who resided in Albany knew this and took full advantage of outside resources.
A lot of African-Americans would come to Moultrie, and a lot of times they would come right down the street because the Albany Highway leads right into 3rd Street, and they would go to downtown Moultrie to shop.
Although blacks could do their shopping more loosely in Moultrie, separate but equal was still very much enforced.
When you grew up in this community, as you did in any community in the South at that time, you knew that that was an accepted norm. You knew that you weren't going to go over there and drink out of that white water fountain. You knew that you were not going to go and go in the front door of that restaurant.
But even so, blacks continued to progress in the city as Moultrie hired some of the earliest known black police officers in South Georgia.
The first two African-American police they hired here could not arrest white folk. They could not arrest white folk, and they could only patrol in the black neighborhood. So, you know, to say we've come a long ways, yes. Yes, we were progressive. We hired black policemen, but they had limitations.
Fast forward to present day. Wilson sits back gazing at the town he once ran barefoot in on dirt roads. A different feeling to wander where he wants, when he wants. But he says knowing what he does now, he's still grateful to the place he calls home.
We still have work to do. And for those folk who think we have arrived, they never knew where we were headed.
Frank Wilson continues to pass along oral histories here at the Albany Civil Rights Institute to the next generation in hopes that they will spread the knowledge of just how far we've come and where we still must go.
The stories of perseverance don't end there. Hundreds of people walked in these footsteps that summer in 1962, walking with pride as they fought for equality.
We'll walk along the same path freedom fighters took all those years ago, hearing from two sisters united by blood and their experience walking along Freedom Alley.
They looked at him and said, "We can't take this any longer."
WALB News presents a one-hour special report. Our history, Road to Equality.
There are differing opinions out there. Was the Albany movement a success? Now, some say yes because the protesters straightened out their strategies in Albany.
Others say no because of the police chief at the time, Lori Pritchett. Now, Emily Forrester introduces us to an item of his that many say represents his role in the movement.
It's a painful reminder of what folk endured just to try to have equality here in Albany, Georgia.
This Billy Club has found a home at the Albany Civil Rights Institute.
The Billy Club was a weapon that was used to keep people from moving forward.
But this one represents much more.
As the story goes,
there's a story behind it involving a young protester being released from jail in Albany in the early 1960s.
The Billy Club was laying on the police chief's desk. While the chief's back was turned the young protester took the billy club and stuck it down in his pants.
That police chief in Albany at the time, Laurie Pritchett, an Army veteran with whom some say Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. met his match.
There was no violence on our part whatsoever.
His aim, the King Institute at Stanford University says it was to respond to nonviolent protesters with nonviolent law enforcement, at least in public.
They were calm, collect, and did the job, and that's what we wanted.
When Dr. King and other big names in the civil rights movement made their way to Albany, Pritchett made no exception. He maintained that his men would act without violence. Instead, he said they enforced city codes and laws by arresting those who didn't comply.
Dr. Martin Luther King, Dr. Abernathy, Dr. Anderson, and 6 or 7 other Negro citizens have been arrested by the Albany Police Department for disorderly conduct.
In place of violence, Pritchett had a record of mass arrests.
We must be willing to fill up the jails all over the state of Georgia.
But Pritchett housed most of them not in Albany, but elsewhere.
He bought jail space throughout southwest Georgia where violence did take place.
However, in an interview for the book Eyes on the Prize in 1985, Pritchett denied that violence happened in those other jails.
They'll be allowed 2 here in this block, and the others will move out.
This group of pickets have just been arrested for not dispersing as...
Pritchett and Dr. King went on to build a working relationship, though they didn't quite see eye to eye on how to handle the civil rights movement. Dr. King took to the streets, while Pritchett thought the movement belonged in the court system. And their relationship, according to the King Institute, left an indelible imprint on King. Many believe because of Pritchett, the movement was unsuccessful, as the city of Albany did not integrate public areas immediately. But many others believe it was a success, arguing that Dr. King and other protesters perfected their approach, leading them to future success in other southern cities.
When Dr. King came to town, the movement moved from a regional and local affair to a much more national and international story.
Pritchett's Billy Club made its way to California in the possession of an attorney who formerly worked in Albany with attorney C.B. King. That's up until 2 years ago when it was offered to the ACRI. Now, some 50-plus years since it was taken, the artifact, a symbol of the violence and nonviolence surrounding the Albany movement, has a final resting place.
I had a coffin developed for it because we buried this sucker forever.
These are just a few of the dozens of stories we've collected to celebrate our history. We also have exclusive behind-the-scenes interviews with key characters and maps of the historic Civil Rights Trail that stretched across the South. You can find all of that over on our website, WALB.com, under this section, Civil Rights Legacy.
Thank you for watching
And taking the time to learn a little bit more about our history and the road to equality.